The water had always been my escape. I wasn't a fisherman, a yachtsman, or some weekend thrill-seeker. I was just a man who'd lived long enough to understand that peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from space. Space to think, space to breathe. And for the last 12 years, LeadSpace had been a modest boat docked at the private marina near Baystone, a quiet, well-guarded neighborhood hugging the coastline. I didn't live in Baystone. I didn't belong to their residential council. I didn't vote in their pointless committee elections. I simply paid my rent to the actual marina owner, a quiet old couple who inherited the lease decades ago and didn't care much about the neighborhood's obsession with order. As long as my checks cleared, they let me stay. My boat wasn't large, certainly not flashy, just enough to sail out at dawn with a thermos of coffee, cut the engine, and sit in silence while the world continued its madness ashore. That peace changed the day Sharon Webb was elected president of the neighborhood board. She wasn't just any board president. She was the sort of woman who looked at the ocean not with wonder, but with plans. Heavy-set, always in floral linen, and with a mouth that barely waited for your response before moving to her next directive, Sharon carried herself like someone perpetually auditioning for a position that didn't exist. Power wasn't a tool for her. It was nourishment. And the moment she began her term, the dock became part of her jurisdiction. Or so she claimed. I was on the water when I received the first notice, an envelope left at the marina gate with my name written in a wide, swooping script. Unauthorized mooring. It read in bold, red letters. Remove vessel within 48 hours or face action. No name, no letterhead. Just a photocopy of a supposed ordinance buried somewhere in the neighborhood's internal rules. I ignored it. My lease was clear. I wasn't part of Baystone. The Marina Lease belonged to the Carruthers, and I paid them, not the board. I assumed it was a mistake, or an overreach by a newly empowered busybody trying to mark her territory. I was wrong. By the end of the week, I was getting daily visits from inspectors. Not from the city, mind you. Just two men in matching polo shirts bearing the Baystone logo, armed with clipboards and thinly veiled threats. They asked for permits, boat registration, lease papers, anything that would let them find a gap, something they could twist into leverage. I didn't give them anything. They had no authority, and they knew it. But their presence alone was enough to start whispers among other dockers. Some started moving their boats out of caution. Others started siding with Sharon, or at least staying silent. The mood shifted. What had once been a neutral space, a place for wind and tide, now carried a pulse of tension. I could feel it in every glance from the dock, every pause in conversation. Then the Carruthers called. "We've been contacted by the board," Mr. Carruthers said, his voice thin and nervous. "They're asserting some regulatory claim over the marina, saying we're non-compliant. Sharon says we've been violating stormwater runoff codes, something about liability exposure." He sighed. "We're too old for a legal fight. We're considering selling the lease." I asked who to. There was a pause. They didn't say, but the offer came anonymously. I didn't sleep that night. I knew what was happening. This wasn't about me, or my boat, or even some technical infraction. It was a purge. Sharon wanted control of the water, not for sailing, not for policy, but because it was one of the few things that still existed outside the board's grasp. And people like Sharon hated that more than anything, not being in control. Still, I didn't act. Not yet. I wasn't about to become one of those men who respond to inconvenience with fire and lawsuits. I waited. I made calls. I pulled out my lease agreement. And, importantly, I did what I assumed Sharon never expected. I went quiet. 2 weeks later, the dock gates were locked without notice. A fresh set of cameras were installed. A laminated sign declared the area temporarily closed for inspection. Signed again with no name, just the Baystone logo. My boat, still moored at the far end, became inaccessible. I wasn't given a key or a code. When I called the number listed, I reached a voicemail directing me to an email address that bounced every time I sent a message. So I drove down to the Carruthers house. Mr. Carruthers answered in his robe, bags under his eyes like bruises. "We sold the lease," he said before I could even ask. "We couldn't deal with them anymore. The buyer was aggressive, pressured us with liability claims. We got a good price." "To who?" I asked. He handed me a card. It read, Baystone Coastal Management, a shell company. At that point, it was war. But I didn't raise hell. I didn't post on forums or call the news or threaten Sharon with exposure. I played it their way. Quiet, legal, methodical. I contacted an old friend from Miami who specialized in silent acquisitions, corporate restructuring, property flips, and ownership layering. With his help, I formed a new trust and began a 6-week process of securing the sublease to the adjacent portion of the marina, still owned by an independent third party who wasn't yet under the board's thumb. It took money. It took patience. It took silence. But in the end, I gained access to the remaining strip of dock space, small but strategic. From there, the real game began. While Baystone believed they'd shut me out, I worked with a maritime attorney to review the regional water access regulations. Turns out their closed-for-inspection stunt had violated half a dozen public safety codes, including denial of emergency mooring access. I submitted a complaint, not under my name, of course, but through a firm out of Tampa known for litigating against waterfront abuses. I remained invisible. Baystone never saw it coming. Then came the opportunity. Baystone's management entity, Baystone Coastal Management, had over-leveraged itself acquiring other small parcels of waterfront property. Turns out, buying power only gets you so far when you've got no real capital. Their books were thin, and one bad quarter pushed them to offload assets. That's when I moved. Through my trust, I placed a bid for the master lease of the marina, the same one they had bullied out from under the Carruthers. It took another month, a silent auction, and a clause in the lease that required maintenance guarantees. I submitted the proposal, and I won. They didn't even know who had bought it. The news came in a memo from their own management team. Sharon's name wasn't on the response, but I imagined her face when she read it. Red, twitching, confused. For the first time, the water wasn't under their thumb. It was under mine. And I had plans. The air was different now. You could feel it walking the marina. Something brittle in the glances people gave each other. Something simmering beneath the smiles. The silence that once defined the water had been replaced by tension thick enough to slice with a knife. And though I had every legal right to do what I did, I knew that this wasn't going to end with a letter or a meeting. Sharon wasn't the kind of person to let a blow to her authority pass quietly. I had wrested control from her hands without ever showing my face, and she would spend every waking hour trying to claw it back. The first move came sooner than expected. Less than 48 hours after the lease transfer was finalized, I received an email from Baystone Coastal Management. Oddly polite, but unmistakably cold. It informed me that a clerical discrepancy had been discovered in the transfer paperwork and that, pending internal review, my access to the marina would be temporarily paused. I didn't respond. I forwarded it to my lawyer and waited. Within a day, he replied with a cease and desist. The lease was valid. The purchase binding. The clause they were referencing didn't apply to sublease holders, and even if it had, they had waived enforcement in a previous transaction 2 years prior. Still, the dock gate stayed locked, so I took a different route. I didn't need the main entrance. The side access road, unused, overgrown, but still technically public, led to a back portion of the property that no one had bothered to monitor. I cleared the brush, replaced the rusted lock with my own, and entered quietly. The boat was untouched. I boarded, ran a systems check, and sat for nearly 3 hours in the harbor, just watching. Baystone patrols came and went, security carts rolled by, but no one approached. I knew they were watching. I wanted them to. The next day, notices began appearing across the neighborhood. Laminated flyers zip-tied to mailboxes and clipped to lampposts. Unauthorized access to marina reported. Residents advised to report suspicious behavior. No names, no details, just fear bait. I watched from the grocery store parking lot as two board members stood near the entrance, handing out forms titled Incident Witness Report. They were trying to bait residents into snitching, into building a case from gossip and speculation. I didn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, I issued my first real act as the leaseholder, a full closure of the entire marina to all foot traffic without prior authorization. It was surgical. I didn't ban access outright. I simply required each individual to submit a request for use, which had to be processed within 48 hours by a neutral party, a maritime compliance consultant based in Orlando, hired under the trust's name. It was expensive, bureaucratic, and perfectly legal. I wasn't targeting anyone. I just made the water something they had to earn back. The same hoops they had forced others to jump through, now they faced them. And it worked. Within a week, I had over 24 complaints filed with the consultant's office, none of them with actual legal grounding, just frustrated people demanding to know why their slip access wasn't immediate. Sharon, of course, didn't apply. She simply sent a courier to deliver a notarized emergency order to restore public access, citing neighborhood unity and recreational rights. My attorney responded with a 3-page dismissal that cited federal maritime use statutes and reminded her that no residential organization held legal standing over commercial lease decisions made by a third-party trust. That's when it escalated. One night, around 11:30 p.m., I received a phone call from a blocked number. I didn't answer. 10 minutes later, I received another, same number. I picked up this time. Silence at first, then a low voice. "You've made your point. Don't push it." I recorded it and sent it to my lawyer. We submitted a harassment report, but I didn't expect anything to come of it. What mattered was the message. Sharon, or someone close to her, was cracking. They weren't used to someone playing their game better than they did. They were used to loud opponents, ones who screamed and protested, who left paper trails and emotional outbursts. But I was a ghost, and ghosts are harder to fight. Days passed. Then, one morning as I arrived at the side gate, I saw it. Graffiti sprayed across the newly installed fence. "Water Thief," in thick, dripping red. Below it, a half-smashed wine bottle and a pile of rotten fish. Not just vandalism. Symbolic, personal, intended to disgust and intimidate. I took a photo, filed a report with the local precinct, and then, calmly, installed motion-sensing cameras along the path and updated the lighting. I didn't remove the graffiti. I left it there. Let them look at it every day they passed. Let them see how little it changed anything. The more they pushed, the more I pulled back the curtain on their operations. I began working with an environmental consultant to survey the shoreline for compliance. Not because I cared about the details, but because I knew Sharon's faction had been skirting regulations for years. Dock extensions built without permits, runoff channels redirected illegally, anchoring violations. It didn't take long for the consultant's report to identify 3 non-compliant installations along the Baystone-adjacent shore, installations approved during Sharon's prior term. I didn't file a complaint. Not yet. I just held the documentation. Ammunition, carefully stored. The board began to splinter. A quiet member named Graham Nichols, an older man, polite, always neutral, resigned without warning. His resignation letter was leaked to a few residents, and in it he mentioned irreconcilable pressure and moral conflict regarding board conduct. I didn't know Graham, never met him, but I appreciated the crack in their wall. Then came the real trigger. A young couple, Sarah and Todd, had moved into Baystone 6 months earlier. They weren't wealthy, not loud, just trying to raise their kid near the water. Todd had been keeping a small fishing skiff at the far end of the marina under a temporary permit that lapsed just before the lease transferred. He sent in an application for renewal, which was pending. Sharon found out and denied it, claiming non-resident status. I saw the file. I approved it. Within 24 hours, Sharon filed a complaint with the city zoning board, alleging I was violating lease boundaries by allowing unauthorized individuals to use dock space without direct approval from the board. This time, I responded directly. I attended the zoning board meeting in person, wearing a suit, quiet, professional, and armed with every document in chronological order: my lease, my legal authority, the previous board waivers, and the environmental compliance report showing their violations. I didn't accuse. I presented facts, calmly, methodically. By the end of the session, Sharon's tone had changed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't object. She simply sat back, lips tight, hands folded, eyes calculating. For the first time, she understood that she wasn't dealing with a problem. She was dealing with someone who couldn't be rattled, and worse, someone who had started turning her own people against her. The atmosphere in Baystone had shifted palpably. What once was a serene coastal community now simmered with underlying tension. The residents, once cordial and neighborly, exchanged wary glances, their conversations laced with suspicion and unease. The marina, previously a symbol of communal leisure, had become the epicenter of a growing conflict that threatened to unravel the fabric of the neighborhood. Elliot, having legally acquired the lease to the marina, found himself at the center of this maelstrom. His actions, though within his rights, had disrupted the status quo, challenging the authority of Sharon and the board. The initial resistance he faced was subtle: administrative delays, passive-aggressive communications, and social ostracism. However, as days turned into weeks, the opposition grew bolder and more overt. One morning, Elliot discovered that the lock on the side gate he had installed had been tampered with. The chain lay on the ground, severed, and the gate swung open, creaking in the morning breeze. Inside, his boat had been vandalized. Graffiti scrawled across the hull, equipment strewn about, and a pungent odor suggesting deliberate contamination of the fuel supply. He documented the damage meticulously, filing a report with the local authorities and his insurance company. The message was clear. He was not welcome. Determined not to be intimidated, Elliot reinforced the gate with a sturdier lock and installed surveillance cameras around the marina's perimeter. He also hired a security firm to conduct regular patrols, ensuring the safety of the property and deterring further acts of vandalism. These measures, while effective in preventing immediate threats, did little to quell the underlying animosity brewing within the community. The board, under Sharon's leadership, escalated their efforts. They organized a town hall meeting, rallying residents under the guise of preserving community values and traditions. Flyers were distributed, painting Elliot as an outsider disrupting the harmony of Baystone. At the meeting, emotions ran high. Speakers lamented the loss of access to the marina, accusing Elliot of monopolizing a communal resource for personal gain. Sharon, ever the orator, delivered a passionate speech, invoking nostalgia and a sense of collective identity under threat. Elliot, aware of the meeting, chose not to attend. Instead, he focused on fortifying his legal standing. He consulted with his attorney, ensuring all his actions were within the bounds of the lease agreement and local regulations. He also reached out to the maritime compliance consultant in Orlando, requesting a comprehensive review of the marina's operations to preempt any potential legal challenges. Despite his efforts to remain above reproach, the social pressure intensified. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact. Children were discouraged from playing near his property. Anonymous letters appeared in his mailbox filled with veiled threats and accusations. The isolation was palpable, yet Elliot remained resolute, unwilling to capitulate to intimidation. In a strategic move, Elliott decided to host an open house at the marina, inviting residents to tour the facilities and engage in a dialogue about his vision for the space. He hoped transparency would alleviate fears and foster understanding. The event was modestly attended, with a few curious neighbors and local business owners in attendance. Elliott presented his plans for community events, educational programs, and opportunities for local vendors, emphasizing inclusivity and shared benefits. While some attendees expressed interest, others remained skeptical. Sharon and her allies dismissed the gesture as a public relations stunt, continuing their campaign to undermine Elliott's credibility. They filed a series of complaints with various municipal departments, alleging code violations and environmental concerns. Each claim necessitated inspections and reports, consuming Elliott's time and resources. Though none of the allegations held merit, the cumulative effect was draining. Amidst these challenges, Elliott found an unexpected ally in Graham Nichols, the former board member who had resigned earlier. Graham reached out, expressing disillusionment with the board's tactics and offering insights into their strategies. He provided documentation of past board decisions, revealing inconsistencies and potential misconduct. Armed with this information, Elliott prepared to counter the board's narrative more assertively. He organized a community forum, inviting residents to discuss the future of the marina openly. During the forum, Elliott presented evidence of the board's past irregularities and outlined his plans for inclusive, community-driven initiatives. The presentation sparked a lively debate, with some residents beginning to question the board's motives and transparency. The forum marked a turning point, as the once unified opposition began to show signs of division. In retaliation, Sharon intensified her efforts, leveraging her connections to initiate a media campaign portraying Elliott as a corporate interloper threatening the community's character. Local news outlets ran stories featuring selective interviews and emotive language, further polarizing public opinion. Elliott responded by granting interviews to reputable journalists, providing factual accounts and emphasizing his commitment to community engagement. The conflict reached a new level of intensity when Elliott received a cease and desist letter from a law firm representing the board, accusing him of defamation and unlawful business practices. Elliott's legal team swiftly countered, filing a lawsuit alleging harassment, defamation, and interference with contractual relations. The legal battle drew attention beyond Baystone, with regional media covering the unfolding drama. As the legal proceedings commenced, Elliott remained focused on his objectives. He continued to implement improvements at the marina, launching community programs and fostering partnerships with local organizations. His perseverance began to yield results, with a growing number of residents expressing support and participating in marina activities. The tide was slowly turning, but the battle for Baystone's soul was far from over. Elliott stood at the edge of the marina as dusk settled over Baystone, the water reflecting the dimming sky in muted shades of copper and steel. A cool breeze rolled in off the ocean, but instead of bringing relief, it seemed to carry the static of a storm that hadn't broken yet. For all the progress Elliott had made, reopening the docks, organizing workshops for local fishing families, launching a weekend sailing school for teens, the undercurrent of resistance hadn't abated. Sharon's faction had grown more desperate, and desperation, Elliott had learned, often made people reckless. That day, the city clerk called him personally. A motion had been filed to challenge the legality of the Marina Lease itself, a quiet move, embedded in bureaucratic red tape and zoning jargon, but a potentially lethal one. If successful, it could nullify his rights overnight. The pressure was suffocating. Yet the idea of folding now didn't cross his mind. The lease had been clean. The process was meticulous. But the problem wasn't the law. It was perception. It was clout. It was Sharon knowing exactly which bureaucratic strings to pull. The lawsuit was just part of it. That same week, 2 unmarked pickup trucks parked just outside the marina gate every night. No one stepped out, no one approached, but the message was clear. Elliot's staff, mostly part-time workers from the nearby towns, started quitting one by one. Some didn't even give notice. He couldn't blame them. The unease was tangible. Local contractors began refusing his calls, citing full schedules or vague community pressure. The gas supplier said there'd been a clerical issue and deliveries would be paused until further notice. The bank flagged one of his recent payments as suspicious, forcing a temporary freeze on a business account. One delay might have been random. 10 in a row felt orchestrated. He began documenting everything: license plates, call logs, supply delays. He had no illusions that this would end cleanly. At the same time, something inside him shifted. What started as a defense of his rights was becoming something else. A broader war against the way people like Sharon manipulated the system for control. On the surface, she still smiled in public, still led Sunday morning walks with seniors and hosted book clubs about coastal literature. But beneath that veneer, she was methodical and merciless. Her tactics weren't illegal, but they were effective. She leveraged everything: social bonds, fear of exclusion, business ties, even whispers at the country club bar. Elliot could see the pattern now: ruin someone's standing slowly, make it uncomfortable for others to associate with them, isolate them, and finally, discredit them through hearsay, all while maintaining an image of professionalism. But this time, her grip was slipping. The town was starting to fracture. Some people began to speak up. The family that owned the bakery near the pier agreed to cater his sailing event despite backlash. A young couple who had just moved to Baystone wrote an open letter in support of Elliot's initiative. The letter went viral on a regional Facebook group. It wasn't much, but it was public. It meant cracks were forming. That weekend, Elliot received a letter. It wasn't typed, and it wasn't threatening. It was from a woman named Lydia, who had lived in Baystone her entire life. She wrote about how the town had changed, not just since Elliot came, but over the past 10 years. She said that when the docks were open to the public, her late husband used to take their grandson fishing every other Sunday. She thanked Elliot for reopening the marina and asked him not to give up. That letter stayed on his desk for days. Not because it offered strategy or legal advice, but because it reminded him of what was at stake. This wasn't about access to water. It was about a town's soul being reclaimed by the people who had been quietly pushed to the margins. Elliot made a decision. No more playing defense. He called in a compliance officer, not just one, but a team, to do a full audit of the marina, his lease, and every interaction with the board. He offered transparency not because he had something to prove, but to publicly demonstrate what ethical ownership looked like. Then he did something unexpected. He temporarily suspended private docking for everyone, including himself. Instead, he opened the marina to free public use for the next 30 days under a pilot initiative for the town's residents. Fishing, kayaking, youth sailing, everything would be organized, safe, and free. He called it the Baystone Water Commons. Local teachers volunteered to help, retirees signed up to supervise, and small businesses began donating equipment. It was a blow to Sharon's narrative that he was a private profiteer, and more importantly, it was a middle finger to her power. The move sent shockwaves. Sharon scheduled an emergency meeting, this time in the main town hall building rather than the smaller community room. Elliot showed up, his first public confrontation. He didn't speak first, nor did he interrupt. He waited until the accusations were done, the theatrics exhausted, and then he calmly laid out what he had done and why. Then he showed projections of how the Commons program was benefiting the town, how youth involvement was spiking, and how incidents of trespassing and vandalism had dropped since the launch. Some tried to interrupt him, but this time the room didn't tolerate it. Something had shifted. Not everyone supported him, but they were listening now. That night, Elliot walked back to the marina alone. The water was still, quiet. But something had changed in the air. For the first time since he bought the lease, he wasn't just holding his ground, he was gaining it. The wind off the bay was unusually sharp that morning, not in temperature, but in presence. It moved through the marina like it had something to say, and Elliot, standing at the dock's edge with his jacket collar turned up and his hands locked behind. His back felt it press against his skin like a warning. The water had gone quiet again. Not the quiet of calm, but the quiet of an inhale, the kind of pause before something breaks, and Elliot had learned to recognize those moments for what they were. It had been 3 weeks since the launch of the Baystone Water Commons, and for a brief period, the initiative had created an unexpected ripple of hope. Parents brought their children to early sailing classes. Retirees gathered near the equipment station to help guide first-timers, and even some of the more hesitant locals began to test the waters, showing up under aliases or pretexts, but showing up nonetheless. But behind the scenes, pressure was building like a boiler without a release valve. Sharon hadn't spoken to the press, hadn't issued a single statement since the community forum, but Elliot knew she wasn't idle. She wasn't the kind of person to lose a public confrontation and disappear. She was the kind who retreated into silence only when preparing her next move. That move came on a Tuesday morning with the arrival of a fire marshal and a city inspector. They walked the dock unannounced, clipboards in hand, eyes narrow, asking questions about structural integrity, access codes, environmental waste storage, and volunteer supervision protocols. Elliot greeted them respectfully, answered their inquiries, and provided documentation when necessary. But he knew from their clipped tone and sideways glances that this wasn't a routine visit. These were people sent with purpose, not necessarily to find violations, but to look until one revealed itself. 2 hours later, they flagged the storage shed used for equipment as non-compliant for mixed-purpose occupancy, and issued a temporary closure of all public activities pending review. It was a precise strike, cutting off the water commons without directly naming it, forcing Elliot to cancel events, refund donations, and lay off part-time staff. That same night, he received a letter from the neighborhood's legal team, claiming that his lease usage was inconsistent with coastal zoning expectations and demanding a full accounting of his activity since the acquisition. Elliot didn't flinch. He forwarded everything to his lawyer, updated the public via the marina's website, and then did something Sharon hadn't anticipated. He scheduled a full inspection from an independent engineer and environmental firm with state accreditation. The audit would be public, the results released in full transparency, and while the marina would remain closed during the process, Elliot made it clear that this was not retreat, it was escalation. He also began hosting informal community meetings at the town library, not to speak as a victim, but to listen, to give space for those who had been silently supportive but too afraid to speak. At one of these gatherings, a woman named Linda, who had been on the periphery of the board for years, quietly handed him a USB drive after everyone had left. On it were internal emails between Sharon and 2 legal consultants, discussing strategy for pushing Monroe into non-compliance territory and isolating his brand through code-centric obstruction. One email even contained a draft of a complaint. Letter with pre-written violations sent before any inspection had even taken place. Armed with that, Elliot met with his legal team the following morning and drafted a preliminary injunction filing. They didn't file it yet, timing mattered, but it was ready. Meanwhile, Sharon launched a subtler counteroffensive. A new organization was formed, Baystone Waterfront Stewardship Collective. Its mission, according to their glossy brochures and chirpy Facebook posts, was to reclaim the neighborhood's relationship with its natural resources and restore balance between private and shared access to coastal heritage. The language was soft, the branding green and blue, but the undercurrent was crystal clear. It was a counterbrand, a way to galvanize opposition under a friendlier banner. Within days, they had scheduled their own public cleanup of the shoreline adjacent to the marina, and began posting selective images of neglected areas next to Elliot's property. Local news ran puff pieces. A councilwoman made a brief appearance, and again, Elliot didn't react with volume. He quietly contacted the landowners of the neighboring parcels, people who had watched this feud unfold from a distance. He offered maintenance partnerships, free signage, and liability-sharing agreements. 3 of them signed within the week. With those agreements in place, Elliot launched his own cleanup event. No branding, no political agenda, just residents and workers clearing debris, painting railings, and restoring broken signage. He provided food, tools, and music. The turnout wasn't massive, but it was meaningful. It drew people who had avoided taking sides. Some came out of curiosity, others out of guilt. But they came, and that mattered. Still, the campaign against him wasn't just social. It was financial. A series of anonymous complaints led to a property tax reassessment on the Marina Lease. The city sent a new evaluation, hiking the assessed value by nearly 30%. His insurance premiums doubled. A stormwater management fee appeared on his next bill without explanation. One of his suppliers abruptly canceled their contract after receiving an untraceable community concern notice about safety conditions. None of it could be tied directly to Sharon, but it didn't have to be. The strategy was the same. Make it harder, heavier, more exhausting, until he either gave up or broke something. But Elliot wasn't breaking. He adjusted. He brought in new vendors, rerouted supply lines, and hired a full-time facilities coordinator to streamline compliance. He also began reaching out to neighboring coastal communities, places where similar stories had unfolded, where local boards had overreached and been challenged. One group, a nonprofit formed by a marina owner 2 towns over, agreed to co-host a summer program at Elliot's site for at-risk youth with an environmental focus. The deal included press coverage, grant applications, and city council attendance. Sharon couldn't touch it, not without looking like she was actively obstructing a regional education initiative. That same week, Elliot's environmental audit came back. Perfect. The structural engineer's report showed no faults. The fire marshal's previous concern about the equipment shed was overturned by a certified inspector. With those documents, Elliot filed for a reinstatement of activities, which the city approved. But before reopening, he made one final move. He filed a complaint to the State Ethics Commission regarding the conduct of neighborhood board members in relation to private contract interference and zoning manipulation. He attached the emails from the USB drive and requested anonymity until formal review. It would take time, but it was in motion. When the marina reopened, Elliot didn't hold a ribbon cutting or make a speech. He stood by the water, hands behind his back, same as always, and watched as families returned, students paddled out, and volunteers resumed their work. Sharon hadn't shown her face in days. Rumors said she was taking a step back. Others claimed she'd hired a PR consultant. Elliot didn't care. He wasn't here for the theater. He was here for the water. And the people who still believed it belonged to more than just the loudest voice in the room. The sun hadn't yet risen when Elliot received the message. A sharp knock at his front door, followed by silence. He opened it to find a sealed envelope taped to the outer frame, printed on thick ivory paper with no return address and a wax seal, pressed in red, stamped with a stylized wave emblem. Inside was a single page, a cease and desist notice. Not from Sharon or the Baystone Committee, but from a private legal entity representing a newly formed management firm claiming temporary oversight of all waterfront-related operations under a Community Emergency Stabilization Clause. The language was intentionally dense, the legal citations vague and contradicting, but Elliot understood its purpose immediately. This was the endgame. Sharon and her allies had taken a step out of the shadows, creating a shadow organization to bypass the previous public failures and engage through an obscure legal route. They knew they couldn't win in court, so they created their own court, cloaked in neighborhood bylaws, buried under the illusion of community safety. The goal wasn't a legal victory, it was paralysis by uncertainty. If Elliot responded directly, he would legitimize them. If he ignored it, they'd use it to escalate further. But what they didn't count on was that Elliot had already seen it coming. 3 days earlier, he had noticed a spike in local filings with the county registrar's office, routine zoning documents, noise permits, waterway activity logs, all submitted under different LLCs but traced back, through sloppy paperwork, to the same P.O. box used by Sharon's former counsel. He had flagged it to his attorney, who began compiling an opposition brief preemptively. But the real shift came from a different direction. A whistleblower from inside the management firm, an anonymous voice calling from a payphone in a gas station 20 miles out, left a voicemail on the Marina's business line. "Check the water quality reports from last month. They're burying something. Don't trust the state lab. Look at the private submission." That night, Elliot stayed up until dawn pulling files. Sure enough, there were 2 versions of the latest environmental report. One from the public archive, showing ideal conditions, and another from a third-party consultant, marked confidential, showing traces of oil leakage near the northeast runoff pipe, an area adjacent to the new waterfront development funded by a shell company linked to Sharon's real estate contacts. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was deliberate suppression of environmental data to protect a financial interest. Elliot could have taken the evidence to the press, but he didn't. Instead, he forwarded it to a state environmental enforcement office with a formal inquiry, then called a contact at the Coastal Infrastructure Oversight Board. His plan was precise: trigger a state-level audit that would place a temporary freeze on all shoreline development, including anything tied to the new emergency management entity. Within 48 hours, a representative from the Office of Environmental Integrity arrived unannounced to take water samples. The marina remained open, but Sharon's side of the shoreline was now under review, its permits suspended, its work halted. Residents began asking questions. News spread quickly, and without Sharon out front to control the narrative, suspicion bloomed. By the time Elliot stood before the city's Coastal Zoning Committee 2 days later, he wasn't speaking to stone-faced officials. He was speaking to a room full of people who had seen the pattern unfold. He laid out everything with quiet resolve: the shell companies, the falsified water reports, the manufactured legal threats, the personal harassment. He cited not just legal evidence but a timeline of obstruction, escalation, and deception. His voice didn't waver. He wasn't angry. He didn't posture. He simply told the truth. And when he finished, there was silence. Not out of shock, but because the weight of everything was finally clear. The committee members exchanged glances, leaned in, asked questions not with skepticism but with urgency. One member, visibly uncomfortable, admitted that several permits had been fast-tracked with minimal review. Another requested a recess to confer with legal counsel. By the end of the session, the committee issued a formal injunction against any entity attempting to enforce waterfront control outside of city-licensed authority, pending full investigation. It was a technical decision, but it was also a direct hit. Sharon's new organization was immediately dissolved. Her private legal support retracted, and the P.O. box associated with her efforts was shut down within days. The environmental audit escalated to a formal violation notice, and the county launched a parallel review into potential misuse of zoning authority by members of the Baystone Board. Sharon herself didn't show her face. Rumors swirled. Some said she had been advised to leave town. Others claimed she was meeting with legal counsel to avoid indictment. Elliot didn't care where she was. He had never sought her destruction. All he wanted was the right to operate without coercion. But in clearing that path, he had revealed something much larger: a system built on mutual silence, self-interest, and social intimidation. The marina remained open, The Commons program was reinstated. But now, Elliot made a quiet change. He installed a placard at the entrance, not just with operating hours or safety notices, but with a public record index number linked to the court ruling that affirmed his rights. It was a subtle message. This place is governed by law, not whispers. And for the first time since arriving in Baystone, people began to greet him not with caution, but with respect. Not everyone agreed with him, not everyone liked what he had done, but they understood one thing clearly. He had stood up when others folded. He hadn't won through power or popularity. He had won through precision, resilience, and the willingness to play the long game. There was no announcement when Sharon left Baystone. No moving trucks, no for sale sign, no awkward goodbyes at committee meetings or farewell brunches. One day she was there, circling the marina in oversized sunglasses, still pretending she had some jurisdiction over the water, and the next, she was simply gone. Her house sat empty for weeks, blinds drawn tight, mailbox overflowing. Rumors floated. Legal trouble, family illness, voluntary retirement. The truth didn't matter anymore. Her absence was louder than any confrontation could have been, and the silence she left behind was oddly peaceful. Elliot didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He didn't even mention her name again. The fight had never been about Sharon as a person. It had been about a system that allowed people like her to act with impunity, to dress control in the language of community, and to weaponize bureaucracy against anyone who didn't bow to it. And now, without her, Baystone breathed differently. The pressure that had weighed down conversations lifted. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact began offering small nods, then cautious hellos. One man who had testified against Elliot at the zoning committee quietly approached him on a Wednesday morning, not with an apology, but with a simple question. Could his daughter sign up for the next sailing workshop? Elliot nodded. No words were needed. The message was clear enough. The marina stabilized in the months that followed. The grant funding secured through the environmental initiative allowed for major upgrades, new docks, a fully equipped safety station, and a solar-powered navigation system for evening programs. Elliot appointed a small board, not from the neighborhood, but from outside the old power circles. Local teachers, small business owners, and volunteers who had shown up even when it was inconvenient. The rules were simple: transparency, accountability, accessibility. Every meeting was recorded. Every decision was posted publicly. It wasn't perfect, and Elliot never pretended it would be. But it was real, tangible, functional, and for the first time, people felt they had a stake in it. One evening in late summer, as the sun sank low and painted the bay in copper light, Elliot stood near the bow of his boat and looked out at the water. Children were laughing from the end of the dock, their fishing lines tangled, their sneakers soaked. A woman from the bakery was setting up folding chairs for an open-air reading, and a pair of old veterans sat by the edge of the marina, quietly playing cards. It was nothing special, nothing that would make headlines. But it was exactly what Elliot had fought for. A space free from posturing, from silent threats and passive-aggressive mandates, from exclusion dressed as order. A place where the water belonged to everyone, not in theory, but in practice. He still received the occasional letter, of course, some anonymous, some polite, some not. One particularly bitter message called him an arrogant tyrant in civic clothing. Elliot laughed when he read that one, not because it was wrong, but because it was too late. The tide had turned long ago, and no amount of bitterness could rewrite that. The people had chosen stability over theatrics, substance over posturing, and Elliot, he had simply outlasted the noise. He still spent his mornings on the boat, coffee in hand, notebook in lap, watching the sun rise behind the quiet curve of the shoreline. Not because he was nostalgic or sentimental, but because in those moments, When the water was still and the town was quiet, he remembered exactly why it had all mattered.